What happens when a woman serves coffee to the wrong kind of customer? At least in the eyes of a town that still judges people by their jackets. Janice Miller wasn't trying to make a statement. She was just running her father's old diner the only way she knew how, with decency, and without asking questions no one had the right to ask. But the moment she stood between a biker and two officers who thought they could push him around, everything changed. Overnight, her business was boycotted, her name whispered like a warning, and the silence around her grew heavy. What came next wasn't justice from the system. It was something older, rougher, and in its own way, more honorable. This isn't a story about rebellion. It's a story about quiet resistance, about the power of standing your ground when it would be easier to step aside. And it begins with a single plate of eggs, and the courage not to flinch. The sign above the diner still said Miller's, even though Janice hadn't been a Miller for nearly 3 decades. Her father built the place back in '57, and even though the roof sagged and the booths creaked, she kept it running the same way he did. Coffee hot, doors open, judgment left outside. It was a slow Tuesday. The kind of day where the only sounds were forks on plates and the tick of the ceiling fan that never stopped spinning. Janice, now 63, wiped down the counter for the time and glanced at the door just as it opened. A man stepped in, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn-out leather jacket with faded patches. He looked like trouble to some. To Janice, he looked tired. He nodded once and sat near the window. She noticed how he didn't look at the menu, didn't pull out a phone, didn't even make eye contact with the other customers who'd suddenly gone quiet. The atmosphere shifted. Not with noise, but with hesitation. The older couple in booth 2 stopped eating. A younger waitress whispered something as she walked past. Janice ignored them all and poured him a cup of coffee. He looked up, eyes dark, rimmed with sleeplessness. No hostility, just a kind of heavy silence that Janice recognized. She'd seen it before, on men who had nothing left to fight except the ache in their chest. "You want breakfast?" she asked plainly. He nodded. "Just eggs, however you make 'em." She brought him eggs, toast, and extra bacon without asking. And when she handed him the plate, she saw it, the photo in his wallet, barely tucked back in after he paid. A young girl with a breathing tube and a shy smile. "She's my daughter," he said quietly, noticing her glance. "I'm headed to Denver. They said she might not have long." Janice didn't ask questions. She just stood there for a second, then nodded and said, "Eat while it's hot." From across the room, she felt the disapproval. The kind that doesn't say anything out loud, but speaks volumes in the way people stop tipping, stop smiling, stop coming in. She knew what they were thinking, that she'd just served someone who didn't belong. But Janice had seen enough of the world to know this much. You don't judge a man by his jacket. You judge him by how he carries the weight he didn't ask for. And that man, Calvin Reese, was carrying more than most could bear. As he finished his meal and folded a $20 bill beneath the plate, he thanked her with a look that said more than words could. Janice didn't smile. She just nodded again and turned back to the coffee pot. She didn't know that in less than 24 hours, the weight he carried would bring 100 others to her doorstep. But for now, she just watched him walk out, quietly, respectfully, like a man raised right but pushed hard, and the bell above the diner door rang behind him, soft, steady, almost like a warning. Janice didn't talk much about politics. She didn't post signs in the window or argue about what was right. But she knew how to read a room. And by the next morning, the air inside the diner felt colder, even with the griddle running hot. The chairs were still tucked neatly under the tables. The coffee machine hummed. But the regulars were quieter than usual. Eyes down. Conversations clipped. And by the time the lunch hour rolled around, Janice saw the familiar black and white cruiser pull up outside. Deputy Ward stepped in first. Late 40s, crisp uniform, the kind of walk that said he'd grown too used to being the final word in a town that rarely questioned him. Behind him came Deputy Lowe, 10 years younger, hungrier in the eyes, already chewing gum like he owned the place. They didn't ask to be seated, just scanned the room and zeroed in on the empty booth where Calvin Reese had sat the day before. "You got a biker through here yesterday?" Ward asked, too loud for comfort. Janice didn't look up from the counter. "You here for coffee?" Ward ignored the question. Man like that doesn't come through Milburn for the scenery. Janice set down the mug she was cleaning and turned to face him. He had a daughter in the hospital. He paid for his meal, didn't cause trouble. Lowe smirked. You check his ID? Janice's voice stayed even. Wasn't my job. The diner had gone silent now. Even the cook in the back stopped moving. Janice knew this tone. It was the same one she'd heard in schoolyards when teachers assumed who was trouble just by the way a kid dressed. The same one some folks used when they talked about her late husband, just because he worked on bikes and kept to himself. He's with the Angels, Ward said flatly. You know what kind of people they are. Janice crossed her arms. I know what kind of man he was, and if you're here to stir something up, I'd like you to finish your coffee somewhere else. That moment hung in the air, like a match struck but not yet thrown. Ward's smile faded. Lowe looked around and realized no one was laughing. No one was backing them up. You sure you want to get involved with people like that? Ward asked, softer now but sharper underneath. Janice didn't blink. I'm already involved. I served him breakfast. The officers didn't push further, not that day. They left with hands twitching near their belts, trying to mask frustration behind forced grins. But the message had been sent. Janice had crossed a line, and she knew it. As the door shut behind them, she noticed two customers quietly place their bills on the table and walk out without a word. She looked down at the counter. Her hands were steady, but the room felt different now, smaller, watched. Outside, the cruiser lingered in the parking lot for a long moment, then finally rolled away. And inside, Janice did the only thing she knew how to do when the world started closing in. She poured another cup of coffee, kept the doors open, and waited. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes before something breaks. The paper was taped to the front door sometime between midnight and dawn. The edges curled with morning dew, the ink bleeding slightly from the cold. Janice didn't need to read it twice. 3 words, scrawled in thick black marker. No biker lovers. She peeled it off slowly, didn't react, just folded it in half and slid it into the trash under the counter. By 9 a.m., the signs of fallout were already showing. Shirley, the part-time waitress who covered weekends, called to say she wouldn't be coming in until things settled down. 2 of the regulars who always sat at the window booth drove past without stopping. And even the coffee distributor left a message about reassessing local accounts. Janice had been here before, not in this exact situation, but in the kind that tests how long someone can stand before they're pushed to sit. She'd felt it when her husband died, and some folks whispered that he'd brought it on himself by living that kind of life. She'd felt it when she hired a single mom with a record, and people quietly stopped ordering dinner specials. What stung wasn't the silence, it was the speed. How fast a community can turn, how quickly kindness gets rebranded as weakness. Around noon, a man in a sheriff's polo shirt parked outside, but didn't come in. He just sat in his truck, arms crossed, watching. Janice kept wiping the same section of counter, knowing full well he wasn't here for lunch. By 2, the place was empty. And by 5, Janice stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the unplugged jukebox in the corner. The same one her father used to dance beside, back when the diner still smelled like fresh biscuits and Sunday mornings. The register held less than $40, not enough to cover the power bill due tomorrow. Not enough to replace the supplies she wasn't sure she'd be allowed to order again. But she didn't cry. Older folks like Janice had lived through worse than this. Recessions, floods, cold winters when the heat had to be rationed. What hurt now wasn't poverty, it was the clarity. The knowledge that doing the right thing came with a price, and this time, she was the one writing the check. Still, she didn't flip the sign to closed. She left it on open. Because some doors stay open not because business is good, but because principle doesn't hinge on popularity. And that night, as she turned off the lights and locked the door behind her, she didn't see the pair of headlights watching from across the street. But they saw her. And they weren't done watching. It started with a knock. Not loud, just firm. Janice was wiping down a booth that hadn't been touched all day when she looked up and saw a couple standing at the entrance. Mid-50s, both dressed in denim jackets, worn jeans, road dust on their boots. The man had a thick mustache and sunburned skin. The woman held a small bouquet of gas station daisies, still wrapped in a plastic sleeve. "Are you Janice?" the woman asked. She nodded, cautious but open. "We're Calvin's brother and sister-in-law," the man said. "He told us what you did for him." Janice didn't reply right away. Her body tensed, unsure what was coming next. Another warning, maybe, or a quiet request to stay away from things that weren't her business. But the man just looked her in the eye and said, "He's not good at showing gratitude, so we're here instead." The woman handed her the flowers. "They're not much," she said, "but we wanted to say thank you before it gets busy." "Busy?" Janice asked. The man nodded toward the window. "Calvin told his chapter what you did. They told the others, and when word gets around to men who don't forget kindness, they show up." That's when Janice heard it. At first, she thought it was thunder. A low, rolling rumble that made the sugar shakers on the counter vibrate ever so slightly. But then it grew louder, steadier, like a tide of engines washing over the town. She walked to the front window and froze. The street outside was filling, slowly, deliberately, with motorcycles. One by one, some with patches, others plain, some with chrome that gleamed in the sunlight, others dulled by years of travel. But every one of them parked with care. No burnouts, no revving, just respect. Within minutes, the diner's lot was full. The road beyond, too. Men and women climbed off their bikes, stretched their backs, adjusted their vests. Not one of them knocked. They just waited. Janice opened the door. They didn't speak all at once. They didn't crowd. But one man stepped forward, broad frame, white beard braided at the tip, a patch on his chest that read M. Cooper, NorCal Vice Press. He looked down at her and said, "Ma'am, we came hungry, but mostly, we came to make something right." Janice didn't know what to say. She just stepped aside and motioned toward the booths, and the bikers filed in. Quiet, orderly. Some tipped their heads to her in thanks. Others simply patted the doorway as they passed through, like they were entering sacred ground. No one needed to explain it, because some debts aren't paid in money, they're paid in presence. And that afternoon, for the first time in days, the diner was full again. The smell of bacon, eggs, and strong coffee returned to the air, not because the diner was ready, but because it had to be. Janice moved through the kitchen faster than she had in years. No time to question, no time to plan. Just her. A single waitress who decided to stay, and more than 200 people who hadn't come for charity. They came to eat. Booths filled first, then every stool at the counter, then the standing room by the windows. Some bikers waited patiently outside, trading stories and taking turns as tables opened up. No one complained. No one demanded. They ordered what she had, smiled when it wasn't much, and paid more than the food was worth. One man left a $50 bill for a black coffee and a slice of dry toast. Another handed over 3 20s, said, "Keep the change," and walked back out to let the next group in. Janice had seen busy days before. Town fairs, holiday breakfasts, but this was different. There was no noise for the sake of noise. Just a steady hum of conversation, forks clinking, and the occasional sound of someone quietly saying, "Thank you," like it meant something more. By mid-afternoon, she was running low on everything: eggs, bacon, even dish soap. She picked up the phone to call her distributor out of habit, knowing full well her account had been flagged. But before she could dial, the delivery truck pulled up outside. A young man in uniform climbed out with crates in his arms. "You're Janice?" he asked. "Some guy with a beard and an engine louder than mine called in this order and said to make it happen. Said if we didn't, we'd lose his whole crew's business for life." She signed nothing. No invoice. No charges. Just nodded and pointed toward the back. The kitchen filled again. The grill sizzled. And for the first time in a long time, Janice didn't feel like she was barely holding on. She felt like she was needed. The waitress who stayed, Trina, barely 20, single mom, moved like someone twice her age. She refilled cups, took orders by memory, and smiled through the kind of exhaustion that doesn't hit until the adrenaline fades. Janice caught her once, pausing behind the counter, eyes glassy. "You good?" she asked. Trina nodded. "I'm not used to people looking at me like I matter." Janice didn't say anything. She just handed her another pot of coffee and kept going. That day, Parker's Diner wasn't just full of bikers. It was full of second chances. People who had been counted out, turned away, written off, gathered in one place, not to protest or prove a point, but simply to show up for someone who had stood alone when it counted. And in a world where most people just keep their heads down, that kind of presence speaks louder than any headline. The last plate hadn't even been cleared when the room shifted. Not in volume or movement, but in attention. A man stood near the center of the diner. Broad shoulders, thick leather vest, silver chain hanging from his belt loop, boots that had seen more miles than most people drive in a year. His patch read Marcus D., President, Riverside Chapter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Most of you don't know me," he said, steady and slow. "But the woman standing behind that counter? She's family now." The room went still. Marcus stepped forward, took off his gloves, and set them on the counter. "We're not here to scare anyone. We're not here to start anything. We're here because someone in this town had the courage to act right when everyone else stayed quiet." Janice stood beside the register, unsure what to say. She wasn't looking for recognition. She hadn't expected anything to come of it. But the room was listening, and she couldn't walk away from that. Marcus continued. "Some of you might not like the way we look, might not like the patches. That's fine. We didn't come for approval. We came to say this place, this diner, is under our protection now." He paused, not for effect, but because what came next mattered. "You put a sign on her door again, we'll know. You threaten her, we'll know. And if anyone around here thinks being quiet means being innocent, think again." No cheers followed, no applause, just quiet understanding, respect, the kind that doesn't need performance. Marcus turned to Janice, lowered his voice just enough to make it personal. "You reminded us that people like you still exist, that not everyone forgets their conscience when it gets inconvenient." Then, with no ceremony, he handed her a folded cloth. Janice opened it. Inside was a small patch, not flashy, just words, "Honor Guard, Friends of the Angels." Her fingers closed around it, the fabric rough against her skin. It wasn't about the patch. It was about what it meant, that the ground she stood on wasn't just hers anymore. It was guarded, watched, backed by people who didn't ask for credit, only a reason. And somewhere in the crowd, one of the local deputies walked past the window, glanced inside, and kept moving, fast. Because whatever grip the town thought it had on Janice Miller had just shifted. Permanently. By late afternoon, something unexpected began to happen. It started with a quiet knock at the back door. Then another. And then a soft voice from the parking lot. "Janice, you got room for one more?" It was Ruth Ann Foster, head of the local quilting circle, holding a plate of lemon bars and wearing the kind of smile people save for weddings and funerals, nervous, fragile, and full of second thoughts. She stepped inside like someone crossing a line she once swore not to. "I figured y'all could use something sweet," she said. Janice nodded and cleared a spot on the counter. A few minutes later, two veterans from the American Legion Hall walked in, ball caps in hand, boots muddy from yard work. They sat near the window, didn't order a thing. Just watched and listened. One of them, retired Army Staff Sergeant named Glenn Wilkins, eventually leaned over to a young biker at the next booth and asked about the patch on his jacket. That conversation lasted nearly an hour. By the time the sun began to dip behind the grain elevators, the diner had become something it hadn't been in years. Not just busy, but alive. Teenagers came in with phones half hidden in their pockets, recording footage they'd later post without commentary. Churchgoers peeked in from the sidewalk. The mailman stopped by and dropped off a handwritten note from someone who didn't have the courage to come in but wanted to say thank you. And the most surprising part? No one argued. No politics. No raised voices. Just slow sips of coffee, laughter that started cautiously and grew louder, and conversations between people who had never looked each other in the eye before that day. At one table, a woman named Teresa, mid-60s, former middle school librarian, sat across from a biker covered in tattoos and road scars. They both had grandkids, both had lost spouses, both believed that people should show up when it counts. At another table, a pair of young riders helped an elderly man fix his hearing aid. No cameras, no reporters. Just small, ordinary acts of grace that didn't need to be broadcast to matter. Janice stood behind the counter and took it all in. She wasn't the center of the moment. She didn't want to be. But she had become something else entirely. A bridge. Not because she tried to be, but because she hadn't looked away when it was easier to stay silent. Outside, the last few bikes idled in place, engines low, their riders waiting for the next shift to come in. And inside, for the first time in a long while, the people of Millburn stopped seeing the leather jackets and started seeing the people inside them. Just before closing, the diner door opened again. Janice looked up, expecting another biker, but it was Calvin Reese. His jacket was the same, his boots still dusted with road grime, but something in his face had shifted. Not lighter, just clearer. He walked slowly to the counter, took off his gloves, and laid them beside an untouched stool. "She made it through the night," he said quietly. "They changed her meds, and something finally worked." Janice exhaled, but didn't smile. Not yet. She'd learned to hold hope gently, the way you carry warm glass before it sets. She's asking questions now. Wanted to know who the lady was. Janice tilted her head, unsure. "She saw the receipt I kept," Calvin added. "The one from here. Said she wanted to meet the woman who treated her dad like he mattered." He paused, eyes softening in a way only a father's can. "Her name's Cassidy. She's 16, loves astronomy, thinks bikers are cooler than they are." Janice finally allowed a smile. She said, and I quote, "She sounds like the kind of woman who doesn't flinch." Janice looked down at the counter, then back at him. "I don't know about that." "You didn't that day," he said, and that was enough. There was nothing dramatic in the exchange. No long embrace, no music swelling in the background. Just two people who understood that sometimes the deepest thanks doesn't need to be spoken out loud. Calvin slid a small envelope across the counter. Janice didn't open it. She didn't need to. "I'll bring her by," he said, turning to leave. "Not today, but soon, when she's strong enough to walk on her own." As he reached the door, Janice spoke one last time. "She doesn't need to walk in. We've got a spot by the window just right for stargazing." Calvin nodded, and with that, he stepped back out into the quiet evening, where the bikes had thinned out and the last rays of sunlight stretched across the asphalt like threads waiting to be tied. Janice stood still for a moment longer, not because she was waiting, but because something in the room had shifted again. This time, it wasn't about protection. It was about healing. And she knew that in a world full of loud, chaotic noise, sometimes the most powerful redemption comes in the form of a teenager asking to meet the stranger who stood up when no one else would. The diner opened late the next morning. Not because Janice overslept, she never did, but because she was waiting on a delivery she hadn't ordered. It came in a plain brown box, no return address, no note on the outside. Inside was a black leather vest. The back patch read Hell's Angels MC, stitched in bold thread. But smaller, tucked just above the hem, was a custom tag, Friends of the Angels, Janice Miller. Beneath it, folded with care, was a handwritten letter in neat, blocky script. "You reminded us that not all angels ride bikes. Some serve pancakes and stand their ground. CR." Janice read it once, folded it, placed it back in the box. Then she walked over to the far wall, the one near the register. It was where her father's apron still hung. Faded blue canvas, edges frayed, a grease stain that never came out no matter how many times she washed it. She took a small hook from the drawer, stepped onto a wooden stool, and hung the vest right beside the apron. No fanfare, no announcement, just the way her father would have done it, quiet and simple. Customers came in that day and paused when they saw it. Some raised their eyebrows, others just nodded, but no one questioned it. Because anyone who knew the story knew it wasn't about the patch. It was about what it took to earn it. And for those who didn't know, well, they'd learn the same way most folks do. One meal at a time. One conversation at a time. One moment of seeing past the surface and into something deeper. Janice went back to pouring coffee. Back to the grill. Back to wiping down tables that didn't stay empty for long anymore. But now, every time she looked up, that wall reminded her, and everyone else, of two things. First, that courage doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it walks in quietly, orders eggs, and leaves a 20 under the plate. And second, that when the world pushes someone to the edge, it only takes one person to reach across the gap and say, "You still belong here." In a world where appearances too often dictate assumptions, the story of Janice Miller offers a powerful reminder. Character is not stitched into a uniform, nor worn as a patch. It's revealed in moments when no one's watching. Her quiet courage teaches us that doing the right thing rarely feels safe in the moment. It might cost you comfort, reputation, or even your livelihood. But when we choose dignity over convenience, when we protect the dignity of others without asking what it will bring us in return, something changes, not just around us, but within us. For many older Americans who have witnessed injustice, been misunderstood, or seen communities turn cold over time, this story is a call to remember that our small moral choices still shape the world we live in. Whether it's standing up for someone at the store, listening without judgment, or refusing to stay silent when power is misused, these actions matter. They ripple, they restore. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us that respect doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs someone willing to offer it first. In this, Janice didn't just serve breakfast, she served a standard. And that's a legacy worth passing on. So if you've ever been judged for how you look, if you've ever stood alone in a moment where silence felt easier, if you've ever watched power be used the wrong way and chose to speak anyway, type 1 in the comments. But if you believe that kindness still has weight, that standing up, even when it costs you something, is how we hold a line that too many forget, type 2 below. And if stories like this one remind you that decency still matters, hit subscribe. Not for us, but for the next story that needs to be told. Because sometimes, all it takes to change the direction of a life is a plate of eggs, a steady voice, and the decision not to flinch.